aspects in vision language models. But before I get into that, I would like to give you a brief, um, overview of what the field used to look like 10 years ago and where we stand right now. So this year marks a decade mark of my career working in this vision language research. So it was 2015 at this conference called ICCV, where we published. This was my first publication in. This was back when I was a PhD student. My first publication in vision language. So this is a paper, data set paper, where we proposed a new task, which is the task of visual question answering, where the idea is for the AI systems to answer open-ended questions about images. And what we mean by open-ended is these can be any questions as long as it is grounded in the image. And these are free-form natural language questions, right? So natural language was not a thing back then. We were still writing very templated questions, and the answers would come from a predefined list of answers. So this was sort of a first attempt at making this task as open-ended as possible, and the models should be able to answer in natural language, although most of the answers used to be one word long. So these are some examples from the data set we collected, and all of these questions were written by humans. So the images come from Flickr. If you know what Flickr is, it's a website where people upload images. So images come from there, but the questions were written by humans, and the humans were prompted to write questions such that these are difficult for the model. So we gave them a prompt that, we have built a smart robot and that can answer simple questions like identifying objects and identifying attributes and things like that. So ask questions that will stump this smart robot. So for example, with that prompt, we were able to elicit questions like, does this person have 20/20 vision, right? And here the model needs to know what 20/20 vision means, which is basically perfect vision. So there is a lot of common sense reasoning also in our data set. So anyways, this was, when I started working on VQA back in 2015. And this is just a mock of how models used to be back then. So this is a t-shirt that we printed for the first VQA workshop we organized back in 2016. And actually, I'm wearing another t-shirt today. This is from the second VQA workshop, so 1 year later. So here we are just mocking the capabilities of models that they wouldn't even understand that the answer should be a type of color. This is a bit of an exaggeration. Models were not that bad. They would be able to identify that it should be a color, but yeah, they were still not good. And here, this is like, I don't know if you can see it, but basically here we have two images. In one case, the answers should be different, and the other, like these are, like hard negative examples. And here we are again mocking by saying they'll just say yes and no. Anyways, so here, I mean, this is like, 10 years down the line, we stand here where models are not even, not just able to answer questions, but also do some sort of common sense reasoning, right? So it can generate captions like, yeah, this is a dog, it's a white fluffy dog. It can answer questions like, what season is it? But also, why do you think it is summer? Because the grass is green and the dog is not wearing a sweater. So there is some sort of common sense reasoning also involved here, right? And also fine-grained understanding, what breed of dog is it? Is it Samoyed? And things like that. This is, by the way, from qualitative example from the Flamingo model, which was published by DeepMind, I think in 2022. So this is again using large language model, but this is before they built Gemini and all of that. This actually was a precursor to Gemini. And then similarly on the flip side, where we take text and generate images, also we have made a lot of progress, right? So again, these are outputs from DALL-E 2. So we can see models can do compositional reasoning, putting teddy bear on top of a skateboard, even though that's not a very commonly occurring phenomenon, right? So there is to some extent, they can do this compositional generalization, although it is still questionable systematically how well they can do this generalization, to a large extent. Okay, so that was just to give you a qualitative sense of where we were 10 years ago, where we are now. But let me also give you a more quantitative sense. So we used to run these VQA competitions called VQA challenges. We did this for 6 consecutive years, starting from 2016 to 2021, and then we stopped running it in 2021 because the best model performance was actually very close to human performance. So one thing, if you wonder, is like, why is human performance only 80%? Why is it not 100%? That's because of the it's an artifact of the evaluation metric, an artifact of some subjectivity in the questions. So the way we would evaluate answers is we would have 10 different human answers. And if you just do a string matching of all these human answers against each other, you would not get 100% accuracy, because there would be sometimes, like synonyms of each other, or some subjective interpretation of the question. So that's why the accuracy is not 100%. But anyways, the model performance reached very close. So we stopped organizing these challenges. But what these challenges led to was actually a significant improvement in the performance, right? So this was our ICCV baseline that we had in the ICCV paper, which was a very basic CNN plus LSTM model. You feed image to the CNN, extract, these VGT features, and then you feed your question to the LSTM, extract, it's in the last hidden state of the LSTM, and then just do point-wise multiplication and do classification of answers, like very basic CNN, LSTM, MLP model. And then, multiple people started participating in these challenges, and started developing newer and newer methods. So for example, we saw like image attention being developed, multimodal fusion techniques being developed, better training objective. Then after that there was this era of transformers. So there was like 2018, 2019, we had papers like Wilbert, Alex Mert, where basically now you have one model that is doing multitask learning, not just solving VQA, but also solving other tasks. And then finally, the era came where now we have large language models, right? So now we don't have these language encoders separately. We just have this LLM. And now the question is, how do we feed image input to the LLM? So that is sort of the state-of-the-art paradigm now. But yeah, there has been tremendous progress over all these years. So, and yeah, this, although we stopped organizing the challenges, the evaluation server is still running, where you're supposed to upload your predictions and get accuracy. And I think I checked this last week, and the state-of-the-art is Polygemma 2 at 87% accuracy. Okay, so as Benno mentioned, we precisely for our effort in organizing these challenges for these 6 consecutive years, which led to a start of this new vision language research field. We got this prize at ICCV. I was there last week. It's called Mark Everingham Prize. So those of you who are not familiar with this, Mark Everingham was a researcher who did the famous Pascal dataset and Pascal challenges. He unfortunately passed away, but his contributions, like this prize is named on his contributions to the community, because Pascal was actually a great effort, and it led to a lot of improvement in object detection and image classification. So since then, the PAMI committee, which is like the administrative committee of computer vision, they have been giving out these prizes every year to any kind of effort which is a selfless contribution for the benefit of the rest of the community. And we were very honored that they recognized our effort as starting this vision language research area. So that was quite nice. Okay, now let's talk about a few specific things. So this was actually a presentation that I prepared when we received the award. And here what we're going to look at are more concretely, what are the kinds of things these models were just not capable of doing 5 to 10 years ago. And of course, they are able to do many of those things now. And the goal behind showing this is to, especially for the younger generation, it might feel like, yeah, it's very easy to answer questions about images, right? But it wasn't actually that much easy. There are a few things which you will be surprised. Yeah, models were not able to deal with this. Like, wow, that's surprising. But it did require like a lot of effort, and mostly it is just data that with scale and data we have been able to figure out all these. So they were not very good at visual grounding. This is actually a very if you talk to people who used to work in vision language a few years ago, yeah, they would know this famous example. A lot of these models would just say yellow, because duh. Bananas are always yellow in color. So they were not very visually grounded. They were always sort of most of the time driven by language priors. And what I mean by language priors is most of the banana in the training data set tends to be yellow in color. So they would not be able to really understand the image here and say, okay, no, this banana is not yellow, this banana is green, right? Similarly, they were not robust to question paraphrasing. So if you just rephrase the question, what is in the basket, what is contained in the basket, what can be seen inside the basket, they would be very, sensitive. The answers would change. And all of these are, these are all papers. Each problem has been studied as a paper, and they proposed a new data set. For example, here they would propose a paraphrasing data set where, each question is paraphrased in multiple different ways. This is another work where they were studying how these models are not robust to false premises, right? So here the question is, what color is the grass? None of these images have visibly grass in them. So ideally, the model should say there is no grass, right? But they were not capable of saying that. So they would still answer the question even if it is not relevant. And you can see, you can try to reason about why it said blue, because majority of the pixels in all these images are blue. So they would be driven by some sort of biases in the images. OCR was actually a big problem. There is this whole paper called Text VQA, which is what is cited here, where they built a new benchmark for optical character recognition, right? So it's recognizing text in images. Models were not good at that. But today, if you play with ChatGPT, Gemini, and even like the open source models, they're actually pretty good at OCR. Similarly, knowledge-based reasoning, what fruit this family is from, and these models would just say fruit, right? They were not able, they didn't have these fine-grained knowledge-based reasoning, understanding different breeds of like fruits. And if you remember the dog example I showed earlier from the flamingo paper, it is able to understand that it is a Samoyed breed of dog, right? So of course, they are much better at this now. This is a work that I did on compositional reasoning back in 2017. So here the idea is, can these models generalize to unseen compositions of seen concepts? So here, if you're asking what color is the plate, and let's say model has never seen red plate during training, but it has seen some other color of plate like green plate and red of some other object like red stoplight, it should be able to generalize. So we proposed this benchmark and we showed that, the performance is not that good. But again, like today, these models are much better. But of course, today also we don't have a control over training set, right? So we don't know what it has already seen and what it hasn't. Counting is another famous example, which is still not solved. So back in those days, if you ask how many zebras, they would just say two, for irrespective of whether it is one zebra or five zebras, because was the most popular answer in the training set. So again, driven by biases in the data set. Today, models are much better, but again, they are only sort of limited to a smaller count. They still cannot do counting very well for larger counts, like if you go beyond like 10 or so. So yeah, these problems, that I highlighted are mostly close to being solved now. And the common recipe has been that you just create training sets and benchmark sets, specifically focusing on each of these capabilities. And, a lot of these multimodal LLMs that we are playing with right now, they already have all of these data sets in their training set, right? So all of these capabilities did not emerge out of nowhere. There has been targeted effort to improving that. And compositional reasoning, counting, as I said, this is still not completely solved. Okay, so those are sort of the things that we were dealing with, like over the past decade. Now, what are the new challenges that we have in front of us today? Now that most of these problems are close to being solved. So spatial reasoning is just like compositional reasoning, counting. Spatial reasoning is still a thing that models are not very good at. This is a figure from a paper that we published last year, where we created this benchmark where models have to do the correct matching between image and caption. So here you see the correct caption, but basically models, we would give shuffled captions, and basically the difference between the images and the captions is just that the spatial position is changed, right? In one case, fire hydrant is to the left, in the other case, trash can is to the left. And they're not really good at this matching between image and, because here basically they need to do like a common mapping of the vision and the language and understand what left and right means. Data efficiency is another big issue, where we basically, although we have all these great models, they are trained on millions and billions of data points. And especially when we are in academia, right, it's not, we basically lose the opportunity to build these models because we don't have resources to train them at such a large scale. So can we train these models in a more data efficient manner? This is another line of work that we are doing in our lab, where the idea is, can we align these models to diverse cultural expectations? And basically, there is evidence that these models do better for Western-centric concepts, Western-centric cultures, because of course the training data on the internet is more representative of the Western world. So there is, a lot of work going on in this space. We also contributed a few things here. And another thing that I think is not getting enough traction, but it is quite important, is how do we learn representations, visual representations that are more compatible with the symbolic nature of language, right? Vision and language, by definition, are two very different modalities. One is perceptual, one is symbolic in nature. So we did some work in this space, but this is still like very beginning. We need to sort of think better about, is the default way we are learning representations, is that the future, or there is a fundamental bottleneck over there? Okay, so now getting to the meat of my talk, I'm going to talk about three very specific things that we have looked at recently: how to improve complex reasoning capabilities, and I'm going to talk about it mainly in the context of image editing. How do we improve data efficiency of multimodal LLMs, and how do we assess whether in particular text to image models are aligned with human expectations or not? And I'm going to talk about expectations with respect to culture. Okay, so let's start with this. This is a work we did recently where we are looking at how to how to improve the performance of models for the task of image editing. But let me first talk about, what image editing is. Image editing is, this kind of task where you're given an input image and a natural language prompt, change the color of the basket to purple, and then in the output, you are only supposed to make the desired changes and not change anything beyond what is recommended in the language here, right? So basically, you shouldn't be changing the background, shouldn't be changing the white sheet and things like that. And models are, like, if you look at the state of there has been a lot of work on image editing, and a lot of it comes from industries. These models are good at edit types which involve object changes or which involve attribute changes like this, or even scene changes, like, change this from summer to winter, or change this from daytime to nighttime. But what they struggle with are complex, what we call complex edits, which are these kinds of edits, so action edits, right? So here they have to model the motion, and they have to figure out what this taking of hand look like visually. So this is an action change, and this is not something that these models are good at. Benno also has worked on this. Counting, again, like, counting is, in general, models are not very good at. So even when it comes to editing, removing certain number of objects, adding certain number of objects, they are not faithful to the count in the prompt. Spatial reasoning, again, is, we know that models are not good at it. It reflects here also. So swapping of objects, they are not very good at that. So the kinds of failures they tend to exhibit when it comes to these complex edits is either they will not be faithful to the prompt, or if they are faithful to the prompt, they will not do minimalistic edits. They would change a bunch of other things in the image, right? So this is still, something that is not completely solved. Now looking at, what are the typical methods, what are the state-of-the-art methods to solving each of these problems? So one common paradigm is supervised fine-tuning. So let's say if you want to build a model that does well on action edits, you would prepare a data set for, like, input image, prompt, and then edited image, ground truth edited image, and then you would supervise the model on that. But these are usually for specific edit types. So these models are usually not general purpose. They cannot do a bunch of different edits together. Another line of work that people have looked into is providing more conditioning to the model beyond just the language conditioning. So for example, what if you could also provide the bounding box of where the object that needs to be edited is, and then the model can, be better at faithfully editing only that region and not editing anything beyond that region, right? But here, this is not end-to-end. You need to either ask humans to give the bounding boxes, or you need to run an object detector, right? And then it adds this additional step in your pipeline. So the question we were after is, what is the most effective approach to addressing both simple and complex edits with a unified end-to-end model? And that led to this work, which is going to be presented at New Labs in collaboration with Siva's and Chris Paul's group. Benno was also involved, he's here. Okay, so here what we started working on top of is this mixed modality model called MU3. So mixed modality here means that this is, an autoregressive transformer model that can generate not just language, but it can also generate images, right? So it can consume both image and language, and it can generate both image and language. And the reason we wanted to work with this kind of autoregressive model instead of, let's say, the other common paradigm is diffusion, is because we wanted this capability where we can generate both language and image using the same model. And the reason for that is because we wanted to do chain of thought reasoning as well, which we'll talk about in a second. So we explored three different paradigms here. So basically the question we were after is, like how can we teach these complex reasoning capabilities, complex editing capabilities to the model, while not degrading the performance on the capabilities it is already good at, like object editing and attribute editing and things like that. So we explored like everything we could explore and just wanted to find out which approach works the best. So the simplest was SFT, right? So you basically, you have your source image, you have your language prompt. We have these data sets where we have these reference edited images, and you just SFT the model on that. We also wanted to explore chain of thought reasoning capability. So here we are again doing SFT, but we are doing SFT not just with respect to the final output, but also with respect to an intermediate reasoning. And this is chain of thought reasoning. So again, we curated data sets where we would basically generate these reasoning steps, and these reasoning steps would talk about, like, how should one go about doing this edit, right? So the idea was, if we supervise the model with respect to this thought process, can it do better at the final task, right? And then GRPO was showing promise in NLP quite a bit during that time. So we also wanted to explore that and see, can RL bring about the kinds of the capabilities that we are looking at in the model. So let's see one by one. So SFT is basically, we had these data sets on simple edits, which are object and attribute changes, and complex edits, which are counting, spatial, action changes, and so on. And these are the number of samples that we had. So it was a relatively large data set size, because this is sort of the first round of training we are doing on this model. But this is not pre-training. So we start with MO3 model, which is already pre-trained for, I think, image captioning and image generation, but it has not been trained for image editing task. So the point of this SFT stage was to teach the task of image editing to the model. And then we tried a bunch of different, scheduling, where we first train on simple edits, followed by complex edits, or we train on a mix of simple and complex edits, right? So overall, what we found is so first we did SFT on simple edits that already underperformed the strongest state-of-the-art model, which was OmniGen, which was diffusion-based model. So we were not able to, with this MO3 autoregressive setup, we were not able to meet that performance of the diffusion state-of-the-art model. But more than that, what we were unsuccessful in is teaching complex edits to the model. This was something that we really wanted to do, because we know models can do reasonably well on simple edits, but action edits, counting, and spatial, these are really challenging. So we wanted to test to what extent SFT only can help us with that, and we were really disappointed to see that instead of helping, it is just degrading the performance on especially on simple edits and also on complex edits. So basically SFT was not the route to go. And then, okay, let's do chain of thought, because in chain of thought now, for these complex edits, like, you are providing more sort of detailed reasoning process to the model. So for example, here, change the ceramic mug to be painted in pink color. The kind of chain of thought which, with respect to which we supervised the model, would be of this format. So first it would talk about what is the source image looks like. Then it will talk about where is the bounding box of the object that needs to be edited. So the bounding box of the cup here, what kind of change needs to be made in that image or in that object. And then finally, what would the edited image look like, right? So this was sort of the template, and then we generated a bunch of chain of thought with this, and then supervised the model. And then yet again, no positive result. So with including chain of thought reasoning, the performance further degraded. And one hypothesis we had here is the MO3 model, which we were working with in the pre-training stage, it hasn't been pre-trained with chain of thought. So maybe it just doesn't have the capability to, learn from chain of thought. And then again, we did this experiments where we trained only on simple edits or simple plus complex edits. And then we saw that adding complex edits further degraded the performance here. And then again, looking sort of the results qualitatively, what is happening under the hood. So here is, an image, an example prompt. They will replace this radio with a typewriter. This is the performance of the SFT model without any chain of thought. And then this is the performance. So I'll show the image later. But here, when we do train this model with chain of thought reasoning, And then when you look at the generated chain of thought, it actually is not bad. So for example, the bounding box coordinate it is predicting, you can visualize it here. It's not perfect, but it is actually quite good. And the kinds of reasoning it comes up with, it's also not bad. But it was still the final output. Sorry, the final output still was not great, right? It was worse than the output we saw in the case of SFT. Here, it's more of an image quality issue, but empirically, just by computing metrics, you will see the performance here is worse. So basically, our hypothesis, our conjecture here was that it's not the case that it is not learning the chain of thought. It is learning the chain of thought, but it is not faithfully doing the edit following that chain of thought, right? So yeah, anyways, we didn't go anywhere from there. I also wanted to contextualize this paper, Bagel paper, that came out shortly after, I think, around the time when we finished our project. And here they show that chain of thought supervision actually helps. So they were able to get success in the image editing performance with the same kind of chain of thought supervision that we did not get success in. But actually, if you look at the kinds of edit tasks they have, it's much different. It's qualitatively very different from the kinds of tasks we have. So here, these are the kinds of edits they have. Could you please provide an image of this car's interior? Right. So this is an input image. This is the edit prompt, and this is the output generated by their model, and these are from the other models. Right. So here, all of these edit instructions require common sense, or I guess more precisely, knowledge-based reasoning. So you need to know what the interior of a car looks like. Right. Similarly, here, are there any phone cases available that match the shirt design? You need to know what phone cases look like and things like that. So here, actually, it is more, it is expected that this kind of chain of thought reasoning would help, because chain of thought reasoning is coming out of an LLM, and LLM has all these pre-trained knowledge, right? It has all this internet knowledge, like how interior of a car looks like, or let's say multimodal LLM. In our case, we didn't really need that, right? It was just simple edits. So, and actually, my students took their model and then evaluated on our data set with and without chain of thought, and we did not see any improvement. So it's more about like the task being different. Okay, so finally, we did not get success in SFT, did not get success in chain of thought reasoning. But one thing that we were consistently observing is, if you look at the multiple samplings of this SFT output, right, this is not a regressive model, you can sample multiple times. Most of the time, we would find at least one sample which is a good sample. So here, for example, remove the apples except the last one, right? So all the first three should be removed. This is not good, this is not good. But then, there are a couple of outputs which are faithful to the prompt. So that was sort of our insight for, maybe GRPO will just latch on to this signal and, optimize the model further in that direction. So we just applied GRPO. So, we get these outputs from our autoregressive model, which is the policy model. We have a reference model with respect to which we do KL, but basically you take all of these out, each of these outputs, run a verifier, and I'll describe what verifier we use, get a bunch of rewards, and then do your advantage computation and basically the standard GRPO training pipeline, right? Now, the verifier we used is this vision language model called Quen. So there is no human involved here, right? It's just auto evaluator. Basically, this is your source image, this is your prompt, and you get the edited image from the MO model. And then now it evaluates for two things. It evaluates for semantic consistency, whether the edited image follows the prompt, and the perceptual quality, whether the image is decently good or not. And again, all of this is automatic evaluation. So we are relying on the capability of this Quen model to be able to do this, to be able to compute reward perfectly. And of course, you can imagine it wouldn't be perfect, but at least it is, verification is a easier task than generation, right? So just using that signal, we were actually able to improve the performance of the model. So here are the details of the setup, right? Again, so first we did SFT training, and then this is post training, right? So SFT, we were not able to beat the baseline. But now we are doing post training on top of that, and post training was in different settings, either using just simple edits or complex edits, and then simple plus complex edits. And the unique part about this is this was only trained on 1600 samples. Plus, it does not require any paired data, right? Because you don't need any ground truth edited image supervision. You just need this verifier, right? And then, as you can imagine, otherwise I wouldn't be doing this talk right now, we were able to outperform the SFT baseline, right? So this result here is RL post training on top of the SFT model, and then we were able to push the performance. And the other interesting thing we observed is until now, training with complex edits always degraded the performance compared to the simple edit only training. And here we actually found that training with complex edits improved performance, both on simple and complex edits. So yeah, this was basically, and we have a bunch of other experiment, a lot of details, but I want to keep the message clear. So basically the idea is just that, it was quite interesting that, latching onto this signal of there is one correct output, and then you train the model, it can optimize it to behave more in that way, right? And here's just some qualitative examples. So SFT kind of struggles with complex edits, but other post-training improves performance. So add a ball to the left of woman, SFT actually, maybe this is a ball, not sure. But yeah, it's not correct, right? I mean, even this maybe, I don't know, you can argue maybe it is perfect or not, because it may be not perfect, but at least better than SFT. Swap the position of items. So here SFT doesn't even swap, and makes visual changes in the object as well. This is able to do that. Remove one sailboat. So yeah, it removes both of them here, but RL is able to remove correctly one boat. And this is not a very clear example, so we did have hard time, finding good examples for this. So the action edits are still quite challenging. So opening of the door. So yeah, you can sort of, yeah, maybe the door is open here, and yeah, it's not clear to see what is happening here. Right. And then basically, before we just trained it with 1600 samples, and then we just scaled it up with 32K samples, and we were able to now finally beat this OmniGen baseline, which was a diffusion-based models, and which was trained on much more data. So the conclusion here is, basically what we found is this auto-regressive framework when with RL post-training is actually a promising framework for people to use for improving image editing performance. Otherwise, the common paradigm so far is diffusion-based, like the OmniGen model I talked about. And we released this model all, which is end-to-end model, performs well on a whole spectrum of different edit types. And another finding is, if you are wondering how do you, at what stage of training should you include the complex edits, then RL post training was consistently gave us better performance than including it during SFT. So yeah, the paper is here. You can check out more details later. All right. Although I talked about reasoning in the context of image editing specifically, we have also done this work in the context of just image understanding. And this is, the example that I already showed earlier. So here last year, NeurIPS, we proposed this benchmark where there are pairs of images which are minimally different from each other, right? So either in this case, only the pattern and the color of the tie is different. So it's an example of an attribute change. Here, it's an example of an object change where we are replacing this VCR, I believe, with TV. Here there's an example of a counting change, and here's an example of a spatial relation, right? So we also built this benchmark, and the idea is to test whether multimodal large language models and even models like CLIP, can they do the correct matching between the image and the text, and it wasn't a very good result, right? So models are still struggling with these kinds of problems. Okay, I could take questions now on this part if you have any, or I could just do the other two parts and then come back to it. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Could you say something about the reward function you used versus the evaluation, the ends evaluation, this VIE score?
Yeah. So I think the way either of these reward or evaluation metric is designed is basically you have a VLM, and then you write some prompts for that VLM. So the difference in our case between the reward and the evaluation metric is the core VLM being different. The prompt is what is defined by VIE score. So VIE score is this paper where they just wrote detailed prompts for GPT to evaluate the outputs, right? So we use the same prompt on top of Quen for our reward, but for our evaluation metric, we are using GPT. So our evaluator is strictly better, because we can afford to do that during evaluation, but we can't afford to run GPT for reward. Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Yeah. I have a quick question about the edits. When you show the picture of the two boats that you remove, like the picture with the two sailboats and one gets removed, there is a clear I think you skipped it. With the two sailboats, there's a clear misunderstanding from the model that it doesn't understand that the reflection of the boat on the water is part of the boat. So there's kind of a mismatch between like what the model understanding the physics of the scene. There's a lot of work from the graphics world where they ground everything in physics. So like my lab, for example, we do all graphics-based
Interesting.
physics
Yeah.
rendering. Do you think there's a fundamental? Do you think it's just a training data issue, or is it a like the models themselves need to be grounded in more physics reality to achieve realism?
Which example are we talking about?
The two sailboats.
Sorry, the two what?
The two sailboats.
Sailboats. Okay, I was not able to catch that word.
So
Oh,
you see
okay,
the reflection
here.
on the second one that got removed. The reflection is still there, right? So it clearly didn't understand that it was part of the sailboat.
Wait, where is the reflection? Is it this?
The white part. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh, I see this one.
Yeah, this one.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. So I think it clearly shows that models don't have that physical understanding, right? But to your question of whether it is a training data issue or like a fundamental issue in the model, of course, training data. Wait, hang on. In this case, so the model is trained. This is other post training, but we do an SFT stage where the model is trained with the ground truth image, and I believe the ground truth image is cleaner. It wouldn't have these reflection issues. But I think there are both things, right? Like if you can imagine just scaling up the training data a lot with a bunch of these examples and maybe with and without reflection to give it like a better signal. I think it should be able to learn from that. But here, like in the kind of like we trained these models on like 700,000 examples or 300,000 examples, and it wasn't able to latch on, like it wasn't able to understand, right? So given that data side, it was clearly not able to understand these details. Maybe, I don't know, like we can go into this route of adding more inductive biases in the model, like, physics modeling. But then that's where it gets tricky, right? How many inductive biases are you going to inject? So ideally, I would want these models to learn all of this from data alone. Right?
Thank you.
And actually, isn't this how we learn? Like before we actually take a formal physics lesson in high school, we already kind of learn, no? Like, I don't know, I'm not a developmental psychologist, but I'm wondering if humans just learn all of these things from data alone, from their experiences alone, or do they actually learn it by taking physics lesson in classes? Yeah.
I have a basic technical question about this VIE score. Is it, at least in theory, differentiable? Is it possible to fully backpropagate through it, or does it have to be given to the model as a disconnected reward / feedback from the world, the same way as, say, a computer game score?
It is not. So it is a score you are computing. Now, in order for you to backpropagate it to your model, like there shouldn't be a sampling step in between. And here we have a sampling step. We are sampling these outputs. So because of that, like it's standard, like RL, like you have to do reinforce. You cannot do standard backpropagation. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, like super quick, I want to say about the data, like, yes, you can scale the data, but I think it's also the type, you can make the data more physically plausible by training on videos instead of, for example, like single image.
Yeah.
So just following up on the earlier question, when you do these image edits, it does look like, actually, if you go way back to the one where it was the radio swapping in the typewriter. Yeah, it looks like it's just doing, like, it looks like it's preserving the outline exactly. Mm-hmm. Is there some kind of prior that's asking, like, the masks out the object and says you can only edit these?
No,
pixels?
we're not doing it explicitly, but
Okay.
the idea is, like, this output is generated after it generates this whole chain of thought, and we are hoping that it would automatically learn that constraint, because here in the chain of thought it generates that this is the bounding box, so it should automatically learn that it should not edit anything outside that bounding box.
But that's, that'll do two things, right? One is that it forces unrealistic shapes to things, like that's probably what's causing this problem, and it's probably causing that same sort of bias is probably causing the problem with the illumination of other objects around it, right? Like,
I see.
If you're not touching those pixels, then you're getting wrong, like reflection and stuff like that.
Maybe it's kind of hard to verify whether it is actually faithful to itself, like faithful to bounding boxes or not, because I don't know, like if it was, even though these are not perfect design choices, I think even if it was perfectly faithful, the performance wouldn't be this bad. So it is still like not faithful to the extent we would want it to be faithful. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so let's talk about data efficiency now. And here I'm going to talk about it in the context of multimodal large language models. So just to set the stage, we're talking about models like Lava. If you are familiar, it's basically model that can generate captions about images, a model that can generate answers about images, right? So the typical, like, this is an architecture of Lava, but a lot of these multimodal large language models have similar sort of high level architecture. So basically it looks like this, where you have basically your main compute engine is your LLM, so some sort of large language model, and then you feed, you're doing question answering, right? So you have to feed images and questions to this model. Questions you can feed directly to an LLM, but images, the way you feed images is basically you first feed your image to some sort of vision encoder like a VIT, and then it will give you some representation of the image, and then you project that representation. So you learn this little projector here that will do the transformation of the image features so that now it can be consumed by the language model, right? So you basically map the image features to the input embedding space of the language model, and you learn this mapping, right? That's the only training you typically do. I mean, I'll talk about like different training stages. And then once you have been able to map these images to the input embedding space of the language model, now it basically sees these images as language tokens, and then you can do all fancy things like in context learning and zero shot learning with vision and language. Okay, so there are multiple training stages involved, and the reason I'm talking about this is because I'm going to talk about which stage is sort of the most expensive and why it makes sense to build data efficient approaches in that stage. So the first stage is pre-training your components, right? So pre-training your LLM and pre-training your vision encoder. So LLMs, we know, like, these are unimodal training, so require language only data or vision only data, and then getting that data is relatively easy because you don't need paired data here. The second stage of training is this projector, where for which you do need paired data. So typically the task using which we train this projector is image captioning task. So you feed your images here, feed the projected features to LLM, and then it will generate your captions, and then you do standard teacher forcing, and then back propagate the gradients and only update this model, right? You keep the LLM and the vision encoder frozen. So here you do need paired data, but again, these you can get large scale data, not very high quality. So conceptual captions is a very popular data set where you just mine these captions from web pages, right? So web pages have images and they have this all text field on the HTML file. You can just mine those. So the point being, yes, you do need paired data, but it's okay to not have very high quality human written captions, because with the scale you can sort of average out the noise. Now, there is this third stage, which is called instruction tuning stage. And instruction tuning stage, what you're trying to do is you're trying to make this model, adapt this model to, human instructions, right? So typically you train it on a lot of like VQA kind of data. And here you actually need high quality data. Otherwise, model's performance on instruction tuning is not that great. So in this paper, for example, Lava, which was actually, a paper that sort of is like, the paper that started instruction tuning for vision language models. They used a bunch of existing VQA data sets, like the VQA data set we built and a bunch of other people built, and all of these have questions written by humans, so it's a high quality. Or they generated questions using GPT-4, right? And again, that's expensive, right? You need to pay for it. So basically, what we thought is, this is the stage that requires doing this at a large scale is not really easy, because either you need to collect data from humans or you need to prompt expensive models like GPT-4. So can we build data efficiency into this stage, right? And the key idea that, or the key hypothesis we had, maybe not all training samples are useful to train the model, right? So maybe there are, a bunch of easy samples which offer limited learning values. The model isn't going to learn much from those samples, so maybe we can get rid of those samples. And then on the other hand, maybe there are samples which are too hard for the model to learn, given its current like capabilities. So can we basically find the set of samples which are most effective for the model to learn from and get the same level of performance that you would get from this, larger training set. So this is under submission right now, and also on archive collaboration between me and Leonard, who is a professor at UBC, his lab. And here we proposed this prioritized concept learning via relative error-driven sample selection. In short, we call it progress. So here, this is basically, a training framework which keeps on evaluating the capabilities of the model, and based on that, kind of like active learning. So based on that, decides what samples to train on. So let's look into the components here. So the first thing we did was, like, we have these unlabeled pool of images and questions, right? So the whole idea is we want to use minimal labeled examples. So assume we have unlabeled pool of images and questions. We do have labels for these because we are not doing human annotation on the fly, but we are not using those labels right now, right? So we have images and questions. And then what we wanted to do is we wanted to cluster these data points into skills, right? Because what we are going to do during training is we are going to evaluate what is the skill that the model hasn't learned so far, and it would be useful for it to teach now. So in order to do this division in terms of skills, we basically passed our images through Dino, extracted Dino features, passed our questions through BERT, extracted BERT features, and then we are just basically concatenating them to get this joint embedding. And then we are going to just do clustering, like k-means clustering in that space, right? And then we basically found that we got these really tight clusters. So the bottom part here shows the output. So we get, for example, all the questions about giraffe are in the same cluster. But not only that, those questions are also the same type of questions about giraffe, right? So all of these are about provide bounding box coordinates. Similarly, all the questions about books and the specific type of question about book, like what OCR, doing OCR on books, like finding author, finding title, etc. and so on. So we tried basically other clustering approaches. You can do clustering just based on image features, just based on language features, but then, either you will get similar image features, or you will get similar image points, or you will get the similar language points. You won't get similarity in both dimensions, right? So doing this joint clustering is basically gives you very tight clusters. And then basically, once we have these skills defined, these clusters defined, then essentially what we do at different stages, as we train the model in different iterations, is basically we compute this function. Now this function is basically computing what is the accuracy. You don't have to, we also have another setting where you can just do this based on loss instead of accuracy. So you compute either the loss or the accuracy of the model at time step t on a given skill set, right? So the K here denotes these cluster IDs. So we compute what is the accuracy of the model on this cluster now compared to what was the accuracy of the model on this cluster, in previous iterations, divided by the accuracy in the previous iteration. So basically what we are trying to find out is the improvement the model made from previous time step to now on certain cluster. And we are computing relative improvement, because the reason we are using relative improvement is, let's say, if you make a 10% improvement on a cluster where you already had 90% accuracy, versus you make 10% improvement on a cluster where you only had 20% accuracy, right? So we want to reward the latter. We want to reward the same improvement on harder skills more than the same improvement on easier skills. So yeah, we basically then essentially compute what is this relative improvement value for each of the clusters, and then we have to select which cluster we want to train the model on. So we don't do a hard selection, we actually do like a softmax here. So based on that, we select a few clusters instead of just the top argmax cluster. And by the way, these evaluation of accuracies is not on the validation set, it is still on the training set. So still on the training set, we are evaluating these accuracies on different cluster, and then we are just selecting which one we want to train on. And that's it. Then if you decide which few clusters you want to train on, you query the labels for those, you query the answer labels for those, and then train your model, and then just keep doing it every few iterations. So that actually worked quite well. So this gave us the same performance on just using 20% data, 20% images, questions, and answers, as if you were using full data. And we are not the only we're not the first method. This is not the first work which tries to achieve this kind of behavior. There are a bunch of other baselines also, which also have the same goal of training the model on 20% data. But the uniqueness in our case is we actually don't need any, basically, we only need 20% labels. We're not looking at 100% labels. All of these other methods, although they train on 20% labels, they actually look at all these 100% labels to do some pre-computation of their method. So this was, and then we evaluated on a bunch of these benchmarks. We also showed that, this method generalizes across different architectures and different data sets. So it's not, very specific result to one kind of architecture, one kind of data set. And then, we also evaluated this basically, what are some, other simple strategies that you can use. So for example, what if you were always selecting the easiest cluster, or you were always selecting the hardest cluster, or you were always selecting the medium cluster, right? And then we saw that, the recipe that we have proposed actually works the best across different difficulty spectrums. The other thing that we were interested in analyzing is basically, because this is, self-paced training, the model is deciding itself what skill it wants to learn from at a given stage of training. What kind of curriculum emerges out of this, right? Like, what are the kinds of skills it wants to learn at the beginning stage? What are the kinds of skills it wants to learn at the later stage? So this is basically just, inspection of what is happening under the hood. And we found some interesting results, although they are not very clean results. So for example, if you look at the curve here is showing how the accuracy on a particular skill is evolving. So this is OCR. So OCR, it sort of dips down first and then starts improving. And then the bars here are showing how many samples it chose to learn from for that given skill. So OCR, it was selecting, some samples earlier, and then it stopped selecting any samples for OCR. And then suddenly, like, this is the point when it started selecting more samples for OCR, and naturally the accuracy is going up here, right? And similarly, you can see that for harder tasks like code reasoning or text translation, it's selecting more samples towards the end than towards the beginning. Again, these are not like very clean results, but basically there was some pattern that we were able to see here. It would be nice if the pattern is more clean. So overall, yeah, we proposed this dynamic framework for selecting the most informative samples during the instruction tuning stage of multimodal large language models. And we were able to achieve full data performance using only 16 to 20% supervision. And this idea that, we are seeing some sort of natural curriculum over skill types was actually quite interesting. Again, the paper is here on arXiv if you want to take a look. Okay, I have a third part as well. How much time do I have?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, let's see. All right, so this is, the line of work we have been doing in my lab, where basically we are trying to assess how well these models generalize to different cultures. So this particular work is for evaluating T2I models, text-to-image models, whether they align with human expectations of culture or not. So, this is an example of a prompt: generate an image of a housewarming ceremony from India. And just to give you a sense, housewarming ceremony looks something like this, where there are some traditional decorations, and then, some sort of, I think they're boiling milk here, so some sort of particular kind of food that needs to be made and things like that. And this is the output of, I forget which model this was, some sort of Imagen model maybe, that generates something like this, which is, house being literally warmed with sunlight and this. But yeah, it's missing all the traditional elements, right? So basically the point is models are not, they don't have sufficient cultural understanding of different cultures. The other thing that we looked at was, what if you give a prompt to some image generation model, get the output that is generated by the model, and now ask your GPT model, like an evaluator, whether this image satisfies the prompt or not, right? So basically now here, what we are testing is whether the automatic evaluation metrics are sensitive to these cultural information or not. And GPT says, yeah, the image successfully depicts a group of people breaking fast during Ramadan, blah, blah, blah. Minor details might not be perfect, but overall it effectively follows the prompt, right? So this is the verdict given by GPT. Now, what if you ask humans from this particular culture, Muslims in India, what do they say? They say the women in the images have bindi, which is wrong. So bindi is actually a red dot that women in India put, but Hindu women put. Muslim women don't wear that. So humans are very quick in pointing that out. Women are wearing the hijab in the wrong way, right? So these might appear as if these are minor details, but actually these are quite relevant for the people who belong to those sections of the community. So it led to this work going to be published at Findings of EMNLP this year. And here, basically, the idea was, can we build a framework to evaluate expectation alignment of these outputs with respect to both explicit and implicit expectations? So we sort of defined this explicit, implicit expectation. And what we mean by explicit expectation is basically whether the model is following the words that are explicitly stated in the prompt, right? So for example, here, people offering flowers to Saraswati statue. So Saraswati is this goddess in India, and you see the idol of that goddess. So explicit expectation is to check whether each and everything that is mentioned in the prompt has been correctly depicted or not, right? So are there any people in the image? Is some sort of offering happening? Flowers, are there flowers in the image? Is the statue depicted properly, right? So that is explicit expectation. Now, what is implicit? So whenever we talk about cultural prompts, there are a lot of expectations that are not explicitly stated, but sort of implied because of the prompt, right? So here, for example, for this prompt, is the setting appropriate, right? So for example, does it look like a religious setting? Are people wearing appropriate clothes and things like that? Yeah, are people dressed in a culturally appropriate way? For example, if you're wearing revealing clothes, then that's usually not, good. Is the statue depicted correctly with the classical features? Like, so veena is the musical instrument that this goddess is usually associated with, and clothing and things like that, right? So we wanted to capture that also. So we built this data collection pipeline. We got these prompts from the existing data set. We modified it using GPT so that it is more visual in nature. And then we basically generated images using a bunch of these state-of-the-art models. And then here is where our effort goes in, collecting human annotations. So we show this prompt, we show a generated image to humans, and then ask them to not just give a score of whether this is aligned or not with respect to the prompt, but provide a lot of fine-grained feedback here. So if you give a score which is less than 1, then what elements are missing? Is it the explicit expectation which is not being satisfied? Is it the implicit? Which particular words are not being depicted properly? And also give qualitative feedback on why that is not being depicted, right? So what is missing here? So here they say, it looks like Arab setting, but the saffron rice is usually served on top of white rice, and this is not served in a plate, right? And then we also did evaluations for image quality, again, like collecting data from humans, and stereotypes. Is it stereotypical depiction of the prompt or not? And here are some detailed annotations that we collected. So bride and groom exchanging vows at their ceremony, Hindu ceremony in India, Hindu wedding in India. This is the generated image. And now people say that, yeah, bride and groom is shown properly. This is how Hindu wedding looks like. Exchanging vows is not really correct, because in Hindu wedding, vows exchange don't happen like this. It does look like a Hindu wedding in India. And with respect to implicit size, there should be a priest. Vows without a priest is actually not correct, incomplete. An image lacks a sacred fire. So yeah, in Hindu weddings, it's very important that there is a fire in between, and you do like a round and round around the fire. So these are like very essential elements, and they are not here, right? Similarly, this is an example from a Chinese culture, and people say, yeah, Chinese family, Peking duck, all of this is shown correctly, but there are things like, it doesn't look like a Shanghai restaurant. Usually, there are pancakes which are missing, forks and spoon. That's not how people eat in China. So it's quite interesting to collect, like how detailed of a feedback humans can provide here. So we collected this, we have a set of 1,000 prompts and sampled. These prompts come from 10 different countries, cover 5 different categories. We evaluated all these state-of-the-art models there. And yeah, so overall, we have these 10,000 detailed human ratings. And I'll just provide one main result here, because I'm running out of time. So the main thing was, explicit versus implicit expectations. So, what's the verdict? How often do models fail to follow this? So they fail to follow these expectations 44% of the time in total. And within these 44%, explicit errors are not followed 50% of the time, implicit errors 31%. So it was actually implicit errors is less than explicit errors, because I guess if it is already explicit error, then of course it is implicit error kind of thing. You can also look at the breakdown across countries. So for Western countries like these, implicit error is lesser than for Eastern countries like Japan and Iran. So it's usually we've done other work where basically found that Eastern representation of Eastern cultures is not as good in these models than representation of Western cultures. You can evaluate like different models as well. So with closed source models, the implicit error rate is higher than for open source models. Yeah, I'm gonna skip all this. The other thing we visualized was, if you just look at these generated images and then do some clustering of those images, you basically see that, especially here for South American culture, all these images are sort of like, it's hard to separate out the clusters. So basically what people pointed out is model is not giving any country specific visual cues. Like the images look very similar. It's not able to, latch on to country specific cues. And then we also evaluated like automatic metrics like this VIE score that we talked about, right? How well do the judgments from these metrics correlate with human judgments of how good the image is? And we basically saw that VIE score is actually not that bad. Not that, sorry, look at this, the image prompt alignment criteria. It's not that far from humans, but even humans don't agree very well. So that was like a different issue. And basically, other metrics fall, there's a huge gap. These are some other metrics that people use. And then you can try to improve the prompts of these metrics to make it more suitable for cultural evaluation tasks. And then we saw that we get some improvement, but not that much. And the last thing here is we also evaluated if the metric is saying the model is not, the output is not good, is it giving the same sort of explanation that humans would give? And we saw that humans explanation and metric explanation don't match, right? So maybe the metric is, although it is saying the model is wrong, but not for the right reason, right? It is giving a different bad explanation of that. All right, so to conclude, here we built a novel benchmark to evaluate cultural expectation alignment of models, and we saw both models and metric fall short of meeting human expectations. And again, here's the paper on archive. And just a last shout out to this. So what I talked about was cultural expectation alignment with respect to image generation models. We also did this work back last year, which was about image understanding models. So we built this cultural VQA benchmark where the idea is to evaluate multimodal large language models. How well do they understand different cultures, right? So yeah, I'm going to stop here. There was another thing that I wanted to talk about, but we don't have time. So that will be all. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Raya, for this great talk. If there's any questions, raise your hand here or raise your hand online. I think there's already some online. Yeah. I'll start with one in person, and then after that, I can take one online.
Yeah, thank you for the great talk. I have a question regarding the data collection pipeline for the last project. So I was wondering if it would be any different if we did it the opposite way around. So instead of like giving the generated image and asking humans to say why it's not the correct like image, we do it like the other way around. We give them the ground truth and we ask them to say what makes it like, what are the implicit things that, for example, we would expect the generated image to have.
So just to make sure I understand, you're saying we give the generated image, but we also give a reference image, reference ground truth image?
We only give the ground truth image, like a ground truth image of what a similar prompt would look like.
But where are we getting these ground truth images from? By ground truth, you mean like the correct depiction of the prompt, right?
Yeah.
So are you thinking we get it from internet? But
yeah.
Even if we do that, we are not evaluating the performance of the image generation model, right? How do we do that then?
For example, I was thinking that this might help. And like, for example, if we did like a chain of thought reasoning, it would help us get the implicit things and we would expect the image to have.
Not able to follow. So if it is, but the definition of ground truth is that this is the right answer, right? So if we are already giving them ground truth images, then why do we need human evaluation?
To extract the implicit.
Okay, I see. So to build sort of a knowledge base, like what are the implicit things that are expected to be there? Interesting. I see. Yeah, no, we haven't considered that. And I think the reason we didn't go down this line of getting a ground truth image is because it's hard to get the ground truth image in the first place. Like, you probably will ask one way to do that would be you ask people to collect those images for you, or you just mine from internet. But then there's also a lot of variability, right? Like one ground truth image might not capture everything, right? So different ground truth images might capture. So yeah, there's no like one correct answer here.
Yeah, thank you.
Gregory raised his hand. So Gregory, you can speak if you want online.
Sure, thanks. So my question's a a little bit not directly aligned with what you talked about, but it's more asking for your reflection. I think one of the things you touch on is that there are tons of implicit expectations that are also contextual, and they might be social or cultural, but there are many other kinds of things that you could physically validate. And so I was wondering if you have any thoughts on to what extent we want to modulate the effort in the chain of thought to do the validation in a contextual way. So if I'm showing a picture to a physicist or to a Canadian, then maybe the kind of snow that's depicted becomes very important and a lot of validation is needed. But if I'm showing the same picture to somebody from, say, Florida, they may not have such a refined internal model of that phenomenon. And hence, even though it's correct or incorrect, I just don't need to check it as thoroughly. And I was just wondering if any thoughts on how we go forward with that.
So if I understand correctly, I think what you're talking about is even these implicit expectations, although they're context dependent, they are actually can be quite context dependent. Is
That's
that
right.
what you
Context dependent and observer dependent in a very subjective way.
Yeah. So I think yes. So there is definitely maybe a boundary to be drawn. Like there are things which are sort of more universally expected to be depicted in images, and there are things which are maybe not necessarily needs to be depicted, but depending on who you are talking to, like what is the application for this, it will be dependent on that. So here we are actually not focusing on the latter part. We actually haven't thought about that. We are only focusing on the former kind of scenario where basically, like if you are depicting an image of, like the kinds of prompts I showed, like a Hindu wedding ceremony in India, then what are the kinds of things that any human will point out that no, this is incomplete, or say this is depicted wrong. So here we are trying to a metric. So the consensus metric here is basically human evaluation, and multiple humans, if they flag out the same thing, then yeah, this is more of like less subjectivity and more objectivity.
Right. So I guess my question was more like, how do you think we go forward beyond your current work? And maybe if you're not interested in that, then you can just punt on that.
Yeah, to be honest, I haven't thought much about it, so I don't have any useful thing to say. But I do want to acknowledge that this is there is like there is whole line of work on like AI, pluralistic AI, and how do we align these models on different thoughts and different opinions. I am interested in that, but yeah, I don't have a lot of thought in that space just yet.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Awesome. Any more questions? There's okay, just a nice comment which you can read. It's a nice comment online. Great talk.
Thank you so much.
I have maybe one last question. Do you think these sort of very implicit things, in theory, like the LLM knows all of this already? Like if you just feed it from the LLM to the image generation model, that's fine? Or do you think there's sort of visual, fine-grained cultural things that even an LLM might not encounter on the internet? It's really like you have to see it to know that this is the
Yeah, a lot of these,
culture.
I mean, the point of doing this in the vision space is because a lot of these things are visual. I think I'm trying to remember if we did this experiment. I definitely remember talking to my students about this, where basically the kinds of things that are missing, let's say the sacred fire was missing from the Hindu wedding ceremony. If you just prompt an LLM and say, hey, what are the things that need to be depicted in the image for this prompt? Yeah. I'm not sure what will come out of it. My hunch is that it's sort of a mix, basically. There are things that LLM would also miss, but then there would be things that maybe LLM is not missing, but your image generation model is missing. But yeah, it's a good, we don't have a quantitative comparison. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Then thanks everybody for joining, and yeah.
Thank you, everyone. So should I just end the call now?
Yeah. Or like I do, whoever wants.
Okay. All right. Bye, everyone. Thanks for joining.